Hello and welcome to Class 2 of Dewey Decimal Classification. Today we will be talking a lot more about subdivisions and a little bit more about the structure. So how this class works is that each week we will cover some topics related to Dewey, and we will look at some of the parts of Dewey and kind of talk through some examples and things like that. We'll be talking a lot more about the terminology and that part of it in the class topics that I cover. Your assignments are going to be very practice focused, so you do need to, as you're doing the assignments, to actually have either a copy of the print schedules or Web Dewey open, available to you so that you can consult Web Dewey or consult the print schedules as you're doing the exercises. So although they say quiz, they're more of an open book exercises. You are going to consult the Dewey schedules, the table, any part of Dewey that will help you answer the correct questions correctly. On that note, just a quick recap about where we are and what we're doing. We have, of course, weekly session. We have the weekly discussion, so that's happening, ongoing. You can really talk about anything related to Dewey or classification that you want to talk about. We've already seen some discussion kind of going outside of Dewey a little bit, and that's perfectly fine because we work in libraries. Some of us may work in museums or archives or some other kind of space, but we intersect here in this particular class space. So, you know, if you have a project you're working on, if there's something of interest to you, if you've encountered a challenge, and we've already had some discussions of that in the class forum too. If you have any of those kinds of things that you would like to share with the class and discuss, please do. It's really meant to be that discussion space where we can talk about anything that's related to classification, anything that's related to Dewey, anything that's related to this type of work that we do in that safe, collegial space. So please do continue on discussing, and if you are been a little bit slow to get started with that discussion, that's fine. You just need 4 posts, so 4 original posts, so 4 things you start, and then 4 responses to someone else. So that's really all you need, and I will add them all up that very last week of class. So if you would happen to get behind 1 week, I know a couple of you have things going on where you have 1 week when you can't participate, that's fine. Just catch up when you can. So you have 4 weeks to do all of the work. Now the discussion's the easy part because that is something that you can kind of chime in, and I don't want to tell everybody to wait till the last minute to do all your discussions because we won't have a very good discussion if you do that. But if you need to kind of stack them and do a little bit more discussion 1 week than the other to kind of make up the difference, that's fine. You just need a minimum of 8. 4 new topics, 4 responses. For those of you who are very engaged and like to have a lot of discussion, go for it. Have as much discussion as you want to have. It's a great environment to talk about this kind of stuff. So go for it. Go forth and have discussions. For those of you, whoever, who might be falling behind in terms of the quizzes, or you're going to be out for some of the exercises. So the quizzes are really a graded exercise, and they are going to be cumulative in knowledge. So they will continue to get more complicated and more complex. So I will say try to keep up with that as much as you can. Again, if you need to, you know, if you're going to be out a week for some reason, if you have something going on where you're not going to be able to do the exercise, go ahead and let me know so that I can make sure that I can account for that and give you a little bit more space, because once it shuts down, it kind of shuts down unless I do some additional work. So class discussion, talk about whatever related to classification, related to anything that we've covered, anything that you've found of interest when you've been sort of talking about Dewey, reading about Dewey, thinking about Dewey, any of those kinds of things. Feel free to pitch those topics, respond with those kind of topics as well. And then, of course, we'll have our class session, which is this kind of thing. So I'll post the class slides. They'll usually go up first, and then I'll do my part later. So I try to get the class slides to you as soon as I can so that you can have time to study those. And then, so we'll discuss more like terminology and structure and things like that, maybe a little more theoretical in this. And then what you're going to do in terms of your exercises, you're going to get in dirty with the schedules. You're just going to dig in. So, you know, however you want to think about it, to kind of dig in, you need to really pay attention to the hierarchies, and we'll talk more about that through today's session as well. And I understand that the hierarchies can be a little bit more challenging to see in WebDewey. I'll try to point out some sort of things as we go along to kind of key you into looking for hierarchy, because part of what you need to look for the hierarchy is to make sure sometimes when there is a note, a forced hierarchy, that note will actually apply to everything that is below that particular class. So we'll be talking a lot more about terminology in the next 2 weeks, and follow the hierarchy. I can't stress that enough. Follow the hierarchy. When in WebDewey, it's really easy to just type in a number and go like, hey, there's what I've got. And you know, sometimes that's right, and sometimes it needs a little bit more. So make sure when you do find your number, your magic number in there, if you find it, you know, take a look at that hierarchy and go up and read all the notes above it, because that's what you're going to want to do to make sure that you are truly applying that particular notation correctly. So you're going to be working with the schedules a whole bunch, and I'm going to be working with the schedules and grading your stuff, but I already have the answers. And then, of course, we'll talk more about exercises and assignments as we go along. So this is class 2. We're really talking about categories and notations, and we're going to dig into those subdivisions today. We will continue this process of digging into not only notation, but subdivisions as well. So, you know, I love this little graphic. We kind of looked at this a little bit last time, just sort of our general, you know, a lot of people have this kind of graphic someplace in their library, just like, hey, here's the big buckets. You know, and the big buckets are helpful for us too. And some of you probably have these big buckets memorized. I know you do. So, you know, we have the big buckets. We kind of know where things go. And as we have had some of the discussions, that sometimes if you just have a few titles in one of these big buckets, you know, maybe a few in one section and a few in another class a little bit further down, then you start getting really weird things on the shelf next to each other, because you don't see that full range of the world of knowledge. And so that's really how Dewey envisioned this being, is a world of knowledge and how those things relate together. Now, do we always agree with how those things relate? Probably not. And we have our own way of arranging things. So, but we're following Dewey, and so if we follow Dewey, there's some options. We talked a little bit about options the last time in terms of what you can do with arrangement. You can do sort of the main class and then do your arrangement by the author, or maybe you're going to do your arrangement if you're doing graphic novels. Maybe you're even going to do your arrangement around a particular title or character. There's lots of different ways to do that sort of sub-arrangement part of it. But for our purposes, we are really focused on that, you know, that just sort of straightforward Dewey approach. So we're not going to talk too much about all those sub-arrangements, except to know that you have options in Dewey. So Dewey would say, like, you're going to extend out your number as far as you need to, and you're not going to truncate it, just sort of blindly truncate it. You're not going to just say like, oh, we only go out 6 digits, or we only go out 5 digits. You're going to want to look and to see where you can break that Dewey call number that you've created according to those schedules. So as you go down the hierarchy and as you further define, and then you figure out what your subdivisions are going to be, then at that point you can figure out where you're going to break it. So you may not go out as far as, say, a large academic library would go. You may go out you may even just do the first part of the class, just that first sort of base Dewey number, and then sub-arrange by your author or sub-arrange by your title. So there's different approaches to how you do that. But, you know, having this sort of like, oh, we only go out 5 digits or we only go out 6 digits, that's not really the way Dewey works. You really need to make sure to break it, not in the middle of a class, but break it sort of at the end of one class and before that subclass begins. So Notation, just to review, system of symbols used to represent the classes in a classification system. This is our basic principle, and this is the principle of organizing items on a shelf together. And so, sometimes we do it, it's mostly by subject, but sometimes we will organize things by form and things like that. Of course, we have the decimal notation, that's in Arabic numbers. And, in terms of number building, we sort of have that big class, and we've looked at these some last time. But for example, we have 500, which would be in natural sciences and mathematics, and then we go down in a hierarchy. So we have sort of this next level. So 510 is mathematics, 520 is astronomy, 530, and then within that, like within the physics bucket, so 530 being our physics bucket, and then we have 530 general works on physics, classical mechanics, fluid mechanics, gas mechanics, and then after that. There is a decimal point after each 3 digits. So remember when I said you don't want to just sort of break it willy-nilly. Now we don't always record Dewey in that way, but and especially when we start looking at things that have zeros, and we've already had some good discussion in terms of zeros. So the introduction says it is a decimal notation, but it doesn't really work as a decimal. And so I think we sort of in our head, if we've worked with Dewey, we sort of have figured out already that it's a decimal, but it's not really a decimal, and we don't use all those decimal points all the way out. We usually use the first 3, and after that we don't put any more decimals in. But that decimal kind of notation that we think about, where you're like in groups of 3, groups of 3, groups of 3, that decimal notation that we think about, that's actually the hierarchy breaks. But we do have problems with numbers that begin with zeros and numbers that end with zeros. So we have typically just dropped those. Each number, at least for the end, when we have a 0, we just don't put that in because that does not communicate anything. So that's one of those areas that's a little bit strange in terms of how we do it. So in Dewey, if you actually do it the Dewey way, after that 3rd digit, we put our dot in, that our typical decimal, and then after that we use something that is not really a dot, it's a marker, like a little dash. It's like a little dash and a telephone number. Now most people don't do that anymore. There are some people who still do that, and if you need to put a Dewey number that's very long on your spine label, then that's really kind of the way to do it. You will look at how your notation falls and look at main class and then the subclass and keep going down and where the subdivision is, and you would try your best, and I know it's not always possible, I've done lots of wrangling of call numbers on labels, but you'll try your best to break it in a logical place that represents that where it is in the hierarchy. So you might have the main class and then sort of the next part of it, and then you might go down to the next line to do the subclass, and then you might even continue down that way. But typically when we record numbers, we don't put in all those little markers that go further down, and in fact you won't even see those in most things. Why is that? Well, for one thing, it's just not a way that works in many library catalog systems. So being able to have this little marker just doesn't really work very well in how a MARC record is formatted. So we don't really do that. Dewey, and this is the confusing thing, and I think where we kind of deviate from like where Dewey thought he was. So Dewey himself seems to have thought that he was dealing with decimals attached to 999 whole numbers. So he's looking at it in terms of a whole number and then a decimal point. So he was sort of treating them like metric. But by doing that, he was sort of following exactly what we have talked about in terms of that. So numbers never end in 0 anywhere to the right of the decimal point. To the beginning of the decimal point, you will see those zeros. So that is one of those kind of weird situations in terms of how things happen. Of course, we talked about these already, our 10 main classes. So by now, you should be able to get into The Dewey schedules either print or web Dewey, and you should be able to navigate through the main classes. You should know where your tables are. You should know where the subdivisions are, where the subdivision tables are, and the introduction and some of the things that you should have read by now. So you should be able to do that basic navigation. You should also at this time at least be able to navigate through the hierarchies and to understand a little bit about how the hierarchy works and be able to answer or be close to being able to answer the questions in the exercise. So the questions in the quiz are all about navigating the hierarchy and understanding what you see. So of course we have 10 main classes, and then what happens? So it is kind of like metric, right? 10 classes, so metric's 10 everything. We have 10 classes, and then from those 10 main classes, we divide into 10 divisions, and then we divide into 10 sections, and that gives us, and we have a total of 999 classes in total. We look to see how we can make it more specific, and we do define it going down. So it's very much a hierarchy. The sort of area one, sort of this is sort of the first structure in terms of how we think about it. If you are given a number, and this will be your first 3 digits, the third digit 0 is what introduced the standard subdivisions. Now, this is true for most things, but it gets a little bit more complicated when you get to some of the other things. I will just say again, follow the hierarchy, follow the hierarchy, follow the hierarchy. If you end up in some part of Dewey, and they're doing all kinds of revision, so if you end up in some kind of area of Dewey that does not follow this pattern, you follow what it tells you to do in Dewey at that time. So follow the hierarchy, follow the notes, you know, do what it tells you to do. But in general, in the first 3 digits, so in that first 3 digit, the third digit 0 is where you would see your standard subdivisions. So it would be like in 500, 599, then 501 to 509 would be your standard subdivisions. So if you get to 501, if you're going to be stuck in that 501 to 509 range, you're going to go look at standard subdivisions to see what you need to do. I think the web Dewey is a little bit easier to see this aspect of it because it kind of just sticks you right there in like standard subdivisions. If you are looking at a call number to use, a base call number to start with, and it says standard subdivisions next to it, then guess what? That means you need to go look at a table and look to see what standard subdivisions you're going to use. So, of course, the ideal arrangement for Dewey is that you have the subject with its number, and then, so subject, that's sort of that main class, right? The main class is the subject, and we're talking big, broad buckets of subject, right? So subject and a number, and then you have these standard subdivisions, and those have their numbers, and then you have other areas, so like principles, and then you have other subdivisions within that. Again, you're going to follow the hierarchy. So I can't stress that enough. A lot of the terminology that's in Dewey, when you start kind of taking it apart and breaking it apart, it's about follow the hierarchy. Or there's a note here directing you to do something. Follow what that note says. If it tells you to go someplace else, you go someplace else. If it tells you that a particular term has changed, then you're going to go to that new term. Now, if you have things in your catalog that have that older notation, that older call number, then at that point, or even maybe an older subject heading, so it could be both, then at that point you may need to do some maintenance work or make a decision like, well, we never felt like this term really fit, it's kind of outdated, we're going to recatalog these 5 things. We don't need to really do much recataloging, we're just going to pull them, redo the subjects. Maybe you might not need to do the subjects, it just may be the notation, and it may move them into an area. So it may move them into a new area that feels like a better fit. So that's one of the things that happens with Dewey sometimes, and with LCSH, with the Library of Congress subject headings, is they'll just take a whole chunk, they'll take a subject and the call numbers that go with it, and they'll go, well, you know, that seems like a better fit over here, and we're gonna put it over there. And so, you know, anything that had that old call number, you probably want to move it to that new place, because that hierarchy does imply a relationship. It does imply a connection to that bigger subject. There's a lot of different things that kind of come with that sort of inherent classification. So that's one of the things we won't have a whole lot of time to talk about in this class, because we're so practice-based. But all of these classification systems, all of these subject heading systems that we use, all of these ways that we organize our information, if we use subjects or if we use the classification system tied to a subject heading, there is an inherent bias built into that, because both Dewey and LCSH are so old. So they started, you know, before the 1900s, 1898 for LCSH, 1860 something, I think 68 maybe, or 69 for Dewey. So within 30 years of each other, but still a long, long time ago. Of course, they were started in a time period where different terms were used for people. Politics were different. I mean, you know, the world was just a different place back then. And so how the classification systems were built, how Dewey looked at what the world of knowledge is very different from probably how we think of the world of knowledge being. And he couldn't have foreseen like exactly like what was going to happen with like technology and, you know, all the things that are out there in terms of how the politics have changed. I mean, this was all, you know, really before so much of the early technology revolutions and stuff. So he would not have even been able to see any of that. So that's one of the things that we won't be able to talk too much about in terms of classification and subject analysis. And we're not really talking about subject analysis too much at all, but just be aware that when you're looking at these hierarchies, regardless which system you're looking at, look at where your particular class or your particular call number falls, and look at where it falls in that larger arrangement. You know, how does it fit? And what is its relationship up and down the hierarchy to other terms? And sometimes when you start looking at those, you will see little problem areas. You know, and that can be a little bit kind of sticky and icky. So that's something to just kind of think about. And you know, one of the things to think about is like, then it does impact how things are arranged on the shelf. If you do not have many titles within a particular subject, and sort of on the edges of it are something that would seem sort of icky sitting next to it, and we can all come up with probably dozens and dozens of examples of things where you put something together. I think we had cannibalism and was it cherry blossoms that sit very close to each other. And so if you don't have a lot of content between there, you're going to have a book on cherry blossoms literally sitting next to a book on cannibalism, which seems like a very strange fit. But if you have a big collection, those get spread out in a much broader way, and you can see all that relationship to how all that kind of stuff eventually fits in, at least in the mind of sort of Dewey in this classification system. So it's one of those things where we see those challenges sometimes very apparent in a small library with a small collection, because they'll literally be sitting right next to each other and you think, well, how are these two related at all? And then other times, if you're in a large library, if you just kind of browse around, you'll notice like very quickly, like, ooh, like, you know, the stuff on this aisle, you know, it's like, wow, this stuff is so close and it seems so weird. So, you know, that is one of those things that is a challenge with classification systems. There's a lot of reason why we don't just automatically change things, and it's not quick. Obviously, I mean, you've already heard me talk a little bit about maintenance. Like, oh, you might need to do some maintenance. Maintenance means you need to fix those records. And, going forward in the future, down the road someday, we'll have linked data, and that's a whole different class, but we'll have linked data, and linked data will solve this problem of us having to manually fix something or having to outsource our records to get them fixed, or doing an OCLC data sync to get our records fixed. It will resolve that sort of, we have to do a project or do some kind of work every day to fix our records. So that's about as much as I can say on that. It's just something to be aware of. And as you're looking at these hierarchies in Dewey, and as you're looking at call numbers in Dewey, do kind of think about that relationship, that implied relationship that is in the structure that we're working in. And do know that people, both in the Library of Congress subject headings and classifications and in Dewey, people are aware of it, people are working on it, but that can be a challenge for us sometimes, and it's something for us to be aware of when we are examining these resources and working so deeply with them. And on that note, now we're going to talk a little bit about hospitality, which seems kind of like the opposite of bias, but it's not. So hospitality is really just I think, a fun word, a fun word to explain that there is room to add and expand. That in Dewey and the Library of Congress system, Library of Congress classification, both have this ability. They have the ability as a system of notation to expand, to have room for new category statements. So that's really all hospitality means. It's just sort of a it means that we have created a hospitable environment within our classification system that we can have expansion. Under Dewey, our notation has hospitality up to 9 or 10, depending on how you count. So if a section has more than 9 or 10 subdivisions, some other provision must be made for them outside of the system's expressive notation. And we're going to talk about expressive notation in just a minute. But we are a little bit limited in terms, while we have space, we are a little bit limited because there's only so much space. So remember, Dewey is divided into tens when it comes to this sort of thing. So you can see where, like, once you get to 10, and when you look at the call number notations, once you get to 10, you got to figure out what you're going to do. Like, how do you do it? You goes from 0 to 9, essentially. So depending on whether or not you count 0 as that first place, or you count 0 as, sort of nothing, or 10, and then you say, like, from 600 to 690, that's my room for expansion within that particular class level. So then I would need to go down a class level, or somehow construct another call number, or look to see what other resources it might point me to give me a space for that. So that's the other thing about it too, is that we look to make our call numbers unique to match the specific subjects, and we look at that through looking at where we can expand. Now, of course, as more and more people add Dewey call numbers to things, and we sort of establish Dewey notations, Dewey-based call numbers for things, that notation's getting tighter and tighter and tighter in terms of having expansion. That's true for the Library of Congress subject headings and classification too. Their classification's getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And we won't talk too much about call number conflicts in this class, but it is one of the things that when you are looking at sort of building your notation, depending on what system you use, you're going to want to make sure that you don't put the same exact call number on a different book. So you have 2 different books, 2 different titles, but they have the exact same call number. You want to figure out a system, regardless how you do it. You want to figure out a system for eliminating that, unless they're a copy of each other. And then, in that case, you might put like copy 1 and copy 2 or something on it, or not. Some libraries don't put that on it. The Dewey notation also has places where the notation is not so well used. I think we all know that from looking at the schedules, or is slightly used. And sometimes the editors have used center headings, and we're going to discuss those in just a minute. Centered headings are much easier to see in the print than they are in the WebDewey, but I can give you some tips for seeing them in the WebDewey. And the thing about it is you're just going to follow, I cannot say it enough, follow the hierarchy, follow your notes. And so when you see one of these, you just know, kind of little key off, hierarchy is compressed here, and I need to figure out how it fits in there. Expressiveness. So this just refers to the extent that a system of symbols expresses the relationships found among category statements. Now, I've already talked a lot about relationships and how our structure and our classification, how Dewey implies a relationship between things. That cannibalism and cherry blossoms, you know, how just sitting on the shelf together next to each other implies a relationship. Now, if you are a smaller library and you get some kind of weird juxtaposition like that, then one thing you could do is sort of figure out, well, there may be there's other ways you can do it too, but one way you could look at it is to figure out, like, can I sort of end this one class here, and then I'm going to start on the next shelf with cannibalism. So I'm going to separate them out in that way. So that's another option. Sometimes we physically kind of do some magic so that things don't sit right next to each other on the shelf. Dewey is considered to be highly expressive, but its expressiveness is broken where centered headings are used. And again, we're just about to talk about centered headings. So remember, relationships, hierarchy. That's all this is all about, is a lot of words to talk about relationships and the hierarchy. Centered headings. This is really a way of compressing the hierarchy. So when you have centered headings, they represent a range. Now in WebDewey, this is not as easy to see as it is in the print, because in the print they actually centered them. They tabbed over a little bit and they centered the heading, so it was a little bit easier to see. And then there'd be like a little caret next to it that would tell you, like a little heads up, like, hey, centered heading, center heading, we're doing a little caret here, a little arrow tell you centered headings. We don't really have that in WebDewey, but what you do see is the range. So when you're looking at centered headings, you know, I guess the confusion is that if you're looking in Dewey, that you might look at that number and you might just sort of suppose that any Dewey class number will have one meaning for each of the digits involved, and that each of these meanings may be subordinated. So that would be indented under if you're looking at the print. You know, it could be, you'll sort of see the hierarchy that you can see in the WebDewey. It's not quite as obvious that you're looking at hierarchy, but you'll see that little bit of indentions. So essentially a hierarchy. So that's sort of our normal, when we look at Dewey numbers, that's sort of our normal thought. Like, oh, we have one meaning, right? That number means this. One meaning for that particular number. But centered headings are a range, so they do not follow that sort of thinking. This is a way for Dewey to sort of hide or compress the hierarchy. I don't really know all the rationales for why they would even do this. It may be that we're going to kind of go away from this in the future as we move more into electronic formats for Dewey. But it was a way for them to compress a heading and sort of have that header that has that range in there. And so these, since they're not single digits, since they're not just one notation, since they express a range, these actually break that hierarchy. And why does it break the hierarchy? It breaks the hierarchy because rather than going down, you have this range that expresses something. So these are embedded especially in the Dewey print, and they will actually center them over, so it is a centered heading in the print. In WebDewey, and we'll look at an example, but in WebDewey, it's just a little range there. So a centered heading consists of a range of digits and their verbal meaning. So it's going to be like this, this, and this. It's going to tell you like multiple, these numbers mean these things. So that's the other tip that you have that you're looking at a centered heading. You are looking at a range of numbers and more than one meaning. In the print, they're going to be in the center and they're going to have that little arrow. So here's an example. So we have in, if you're looking in the print or some older version, you would see something that, like in WebDewey, you're going to see something that's very indented like that. And so you see here 372 to 374, specific levels of education. And then we see down here it actually breaks it out. So center headings aren't really any big deal. It's just you need to know if you come across these. If you're searching and you come across 372-374, you just need to know this is for a range of notations and it's going to have multiple meanings attached to it. And I need to look for my specific number. I'm not going to assign 372-374 to a particular work. I'm going to look to see what goes into that category. So that's really the thing you need to look for. As you know, when you look at the print, you get a little bit more sort of information right up there front. When you're looking at WebDewey, a lot of times you're going to have to click on links to actually get a little bit more information. So you can get the same information, you're just going to have to click a little bit more. So that's what centered headings mean. And I have a lot of diagrams about hierarchy, and I'm not going to really go into all of them. I just want you to kind of, if you're a person who like needs to kind of diagram, you like to do sentence diagrams, that kind of thing, please feel free to spend as much time with these diagrams as you need to. But this is all about just how we organize and where information falls. So if you were to take something and you have a centered heading, how is this going to work out? So sort of if you have a class and subclass, so, you know, we have here a class, and then we have, you know, here are some subclasses, and we go all the way down here. That's our lowest down here. So you could even substitute in terms if you need to substitute terms and to have them. So, you know, we have parent class, so our super, you know, what's the highest, subclass, sub, you know, we just keep going down. So same thing over here. You know, these are kind of our things that are equal, but then over here we have subclass, and we sub. So that's sort of what our normal, when we look at a normal hierarchy in Dewey that doesn't have a centered heading or a compressed heading, it's going to look something like this. You're going to have a number, you're going to have another number underneath it, number. So even in WebDewey, that's going to be, WebDewey, you're going to see just this kind of thing, this, and this, and you might have a reference to this over here, or you might have a reference to this over here. Like if you have this, then see this, that kind of thing. So this is just a really abstract diagram of like what it looks like in a normal Dewey hierarchy. Things just go all the way down. And then this is what it looks like if we are starting to look at moving things around and compressing things. And so, like I said, really all you need to know is that this hierarchy that we would normally have, you know, top level, then all the way down, we're just going to compress it and it's just going to be hidden. So we'll have this in our Dewey list would be moved up, but it's going to be a range that would be listed. So rather than saying A1 and then A111, it would say like, you know, A1.1 dash 1.11 or something. So it would just collapse that range. So all you really need to know is about centered headings is that they exist, and it just means a range. So that's really it. And when you see that range, anytime you see a range of numbers with a dash in WebDewey, numbers with a dash in the print, that means you need to investigate more. You may need to look to subdivisions. If you have that 01 to 09, that means you may need to go look for your subdivisions. It may mean that you need to drill down further and look to see what specific categories fall under that range. So that's really all you need to know about this. Like I said, we're focusing a lot in the class discussions on hierarchy and then also on sort of the terminology and things like that. So here's an example of looking at the structure for education in this 370. So of course, education is part of the social sciences, so that's in the 300s. And then when we look down here, this is kind of how we'd expect things to kind of look. We're going to break things down, and then we have some subcategories down here, right? So this is how we would expect the hierarchy for education to look, something like this. I mean, this is sort of like how Dewey works in terms of a hierarchy. Now in WebDewey, it's harder to see the hierarchy. You have to be more aware of what you're looking at, because when you click up, so when you click the number above you, that's moving you up in the hierarchy. When you click lower, that's moving you down the hierarchy. So it's more about navigating the hierarchy than being able to see the hierarchy. So WebDewey, you're actually part of the hierarchy and you're interacting with it as you move through those numbers. So you're going up and going down. When you have determined what your number is going to be, your base call number is going to be, at that point you need to look at all the aspects of the hierarchy above you. And it's pretty easy to just kind of click through and look through at all of those and make sure that you don't have any notes or anything that applies all the way down. And those notes that apply from an upper level and apply down, possibly to your notation, are that forced hierarchy. So a forced hierarchy is when you have something that's at an upper level, some note or information, instruction that's going to apply down to you. And you may or may not be able to see that unless you go up the hierarchy. So always go up the hierarchy once you are where you need to go. Go as granular as you can, get your call number constructed, and then once you have your notation in place, go back up the hierarchy and make sure you haven't missed anything. So this is sort of how we would expect to see it. And as we know from looking already, we don't really see it that way. So we have a little bit of information that's kind of squished together. So like 372.2, 373.3, 374.4, those are all going to be squished into that range, that 372 to 374. So we have that little bit of hidden hierarchy. Again, it's just presented as a range. And so they are kind of moved up a hierarchy, up a level in the hierarchy, but it's a range kind of thing. So hopefully that will make sense to you when you're actually looking at it, that if you see a range, you just need to figure out, what do you do with that range? Here's an example, another example where you have centered headings. So again, range, we have a range. So that would tell us that we need to take a little bit more of a look at that. I can't stress enough, follow the hierarchy, follow the hierarchy. Be specific, follow the hierarchy, check the tables. It's okay to look in OCLC to see what base number someone might use. Just don't rely on OCLC entirely because people are wrong in OCLC sometimes. But it's completely okay to look. If you have access to other tools, if you have access to Classification Web, if you have access to some of these other tools, it is okay to look to see what that base call number is according to your other resource. However, please go to the schedules and confirm that it's correct, because I'm not grading the OCLC record. I'm going to be grading what you put into the exercise. So we've looked at this already. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. It's just I want you to kind of think through your head as you are looking at, what do you do? Like, how do you start? Find your starting number, start that way. And this is how to actually add it in using the Dewey Add Create tool that's in WebDewey. We will look at that next week, or fourth week, we'll look at that. But the process, the thinking process, is really what I want you to take away from this. So really going through that process to see whether or not you have done all the pieces of it that you need to. Kind of looking at hierarchy again, when you see something that says T2, that means you have a table. So this is table 2. So anytime you search, and feel free to search however you want to search. I mean, search by number, search by your subjects. If you have some kind of corporate entity, throw that in and search for it. That's fine to search by whatever you want to search by. But then once you start seeing things, then investigate. So, there's lots of different ways. You can start at your big, broad buckets. For those of you who know and are familiar, like I kind of know where like Shakespeare is going to fit already because I've been doing this for a while. That's fine. Start there. Start wherever feels comfortable for you, because there's so many different entry points to get to this place. So you can search, you can start your hierarchy, you can start at the upper bucket level. If you already know, sort of like I know where Shakespeare, then go ahead, go there. So start where you need to start. But then once you get there, make sure to check your hierarchies and verify your work. So check your hierarchies all the way up. Make sure to read all your notes. So a facet and subject classification is a family of characteristics, and this can be a topical area, a form of publication, a genre, audience, or other feature. And this is really where we start looking at like literature and things like that. Typically, when we have these hierarchies like we have in Dewey, they have usually dealt with facets, but it's not always so successful. And I think we all know from having tried to catalog media and works of literature that it's sort of successful. And that's true in Dewey and the Library of Congress classification. It's sort of successful. So, things, but you should think about it. So things to consider. And so this is one thing that I would say, this is a good thing to print out this one or make some notes. So these are things to think about when you get back to your library and you have that new book that comes across your desk. Kinds of social problems, categories of persons affected, location. So, anything that is a unique characteristic. So things about people, places, kinds of problems, time periods, basic principles and ideas applied. Those are all things to kind of have a check sheet when you are cataloging and you are creating your notation for your particular item. Does this have a chronological subdivision in the record that I'm looking at in OCLC? It has a subfield Y in the 650 with a date or a time period. I need to look at that. It has a genre term. It has the 655 Library of Congress genre terms. Oh, genre terms. That's about people, or it could be a form. It could be like a mystery fiction or something like that. So I need to pay attention to that. It has a 651 subject heading for a location. Well, I need to take a look at that. Or it has a subfield Z in the subject heading field for a place. Again, I need to take a look at that. So any kinds of things you can, if you're working from a record in OCLC, or if you've already done your subject cataloging and you're now starting to look at your notation, look at all those subdivisions that you have put into that record and then make your decisions about how that's going to work. So, example of a facet, this is facets in the realm of social problems and services, and it gives you like this gigantic long list of all these kinds of things you should look at. We're not going to go into this in great detail. It's just things to look at. So what would you do with this information? What you would do with this information is when you start looking at your subdivisions and you start looking at how you're going to expand that notation out. This is going to be part of your process in terms of what you do. And so that is how this is going to fit together. So first, you're going to kind of do your subject, figure out your notation according to your subject. And then for those of you who, cutter or assign or whatever by, author, whatever, you may not go this far. But you may go this far, or you may start thinking about whether or not we want to expand and go a little bit further. So another example of facet. We have a hierarchical structure, and we sort of think of it as families. So we can break things down a little bit more. So it's sort of a facet and a facet even. So we can have social problems by kind, and then we're going to divide those by kinds of people, or by locations, or by time periods, or by principle. So we can keep dividing things a little bit more. So this is how we kind of start thinking about how we're going to not only organize things on our shelf, but how we're going to sort of further define our notations. So, of course, just talking about this, as we've been chatting a little bit about like bias and things like that. But, sometimes we get materials that come across our desk that are just a little bit sticky. Now, remember, when you're looking at an OCLC record, the first subject heading that is in that record is considered to be the primary subject heading. For Library of Congress classification, and typically for Dewey classification, that first subject heading is tied to that call number. So that first subject heading is actually a big key in terms of what main class you should have and where you should start. So that first subject heading, if you are cataloging and doing your notation from an existing OCLC record, provided they use the right subject heading, that first subject heading is tied to that class for either Library of Congress subject headings and Library of Congress classification, or for Dewey classification. So that first subject heading is going to give you the key anyway. You can then look to see what's in that first subject heading. Is that first subject heading geographic? Is that first subject heading, what is it subdivided by? And so we've been using that subdivided word a lot in the last couple of weeks. And so just like we subdivide when we are doing our notation and we go down the classification scheme, we also subdivide when we're doing subject analysis, and we go from more general to more granular, just like we do in the classification tables. So by going subjects more, we're going down the hierarchy. So when you are looking at that first subject heading, whatever subject heading is in that, that very first part of that 650, if it's a topical subdivision, and then you'll look to see what other subdivisions are used in that particular subject heading. Does it have a geographic subdivision? Does it have a chronological subdivision? What other information is used. And so that can kind of help you at least see what the cataloger was thinking. Now, unfortunately, you knew there was a catch, right? Unfortunately, with Library of Congress subject headings, not all subdivisions can be used with all subject headings. And that's really complicated to get into in this class, so I can't really go too far. But just know that sometimes it's not going to be 100% accurate to say, look at the first subject headings and everything that's represented in that first subject heading is what you should focus on. That's where you should start, but certainly look at the rest of the record as well. Look at the rest of the subject headings. So if you are doing this, if you are doing the cataloging, if you are doing the original cataloging, then you are going to look at your own subject headings, but you're going to have a good insight already because you will have spent time with this item. And so you'll know, do I need to represent a chronological? Do I have a time period? Am I associating a location with this particular work? Am I associating a particular group of people with this work? You're going to already know that by the time you get to this point. So you will have, if you're doing the cataloging originally yourself from scratch, you're already going to have resolved this issue yourself. So you will, in the process of your cataloging, you're going to have nailed down what you think this particular work's about. For those of us who are not doing original cataloging, who are just cataloging from an OCLC record, we're taking that record and we're adding our Dewey call number, or maybe you have something in your catalog already that's been cataloged and you need to add that Dewey call number. Then we're going to look first at that first subject heading to see what insights that gives us. And then we're going to look at the other subject headings and look at other information about it. Because not every single record is going to have form subdivisions, even though it should. Not every single record that is about a group of people is going to have a genre term, although now they could. Because some of these terms, like the genre terms from the Library of Congress, have only been around about maybe 10 years. So, you know, there's a lot of older records out there that aren't going to have that information, although they're about a group of people. So, you know, that's one of the challenges to doing copy cataloging and doing the notation, is that you're not always going to have that information. It's not going to be clear to you that exactly what's in the subject heading, that first subject heading, is all you need to focus on for notation and creating your call number. That is probably the first place to start, and a good clue, and will get you started down the road. But there's other things to consider. And then the other part of it to consider, of course, is how do you do your notation within your own library? Do you cutter and subarrange by author, by title? You know, how do you do that? So, you know, a challenge this sort of thinking and sort of arrangement is if you know, divide first by kind of person and then second by kind of problem, is that the best approach? Or would it be better to go the other way and go first by kind of problem and then person? And, you know, that really depends upon not only the subject headings that are in the work itself, it also depends upon what's going to work best in terms of arranging it on your shelves. If you are a library that has collected, you know, here as an example, we have drug and alcohol addiction in Los Angeles and in Miami among female and male teenage parents who are also members of gangs. So, you know, we have two different groups of people. We have genders. Well, actually, we have multiple groups of people, right? So we have, you know, we have potential addicts. So we have, you know, potentially people who have drug addiction issues. We have people who have, and then alcohol addiction. So two different addictions in that way. And then we have two different locations. Of course, then we have, you know, the potential for mental health issues. That may be part of this as well. We also have then, of course, male and female, and we have teenagers who are parents. So we have multiple, wow, they've got a tough life there, right? We have, and they're members of gangs. So we have multiple things going on. And so, you know, which facet do you start with to subdivide? And I would say, you know, look to your subject headings. If you're working with a record in OCLC, look to see what they considered to be the most important aspects of that. And I'm not saying just stick with your subject headings, but that's a good place to start. So if in the subject headings, the first subject heading deals with teenage, and I'm not sure, just without having it in front of me exactly what the term would be, but if you have teenage parents who are addicts, that's sort of the first subject heading. And then, you know, it's subdivided by United States, and then, you know, then it's some other things down there. You could kind of look at that and go, okay, well, they thought this was about teenage parents who are addicts primarily. That's the focus of it primarily, because that's where they focus their first subject heading. And so I'm going to go with that. In subject analysis, the first subject heading should be the most important, and so that would be the first mark field in a record. And then the second one would be when you are looking at, Okay, back to recording. I'm sorry. Lightning had just hit and the power went out for a second. So, you can see where the issues would be in terms of this kind of, um, looking at this kind of facet. So, things that you're going to look at and think about. If the notation is used, if all the facets are given notations or special symbols, the order of precedence, really in terms of how, what the sequence is, and then of course you're looking at how you can list any number of facets in an instance. So you're looking at how all of that's going to fit together. So when we are looking at, and you have already started to experience this and look at it, and I know some of you have been cataloging in Dewey for a while, you're looking at your base number, and we've already been talking a lot about the base number. Look at your base number and then those additional digits. And these are what represent rather other kinds of qualifications. And it could be the topic, so it could be in subject analysis terms, it would say, the subject heading is subdivided by a subdivision of a topic, so it's a topic of a topic. So, breaking it down and topic-wise, or it could be the publication, or it really could be any number of these categories that we've talked about. So base number, and I've used base number a lot already in talking about sort of class and things like that. Base number is any notation representing the class category or categories. And then when you see plus, that means attached to the end. Or when you start looking at, how that subdivision falls into it, is sort of an attach at the end. So that would be what goes to the right. Sources of additional digits, you can take them from enumerated sets, and this is where you get your tables. So it's a general list, and this would be tables 1 through 6. Also, you can refer to the introduction and then all of section 8, which is the number building section. You can also look at in text, so these would be special tables. So this would be where you would see your centered headings. So when you're in Dewey and you're digging around and you see those centered headings, you see that range, then you're going to want to explore that range a little bit and look at that list. Now, do you need to know that you are looking at a centered heading? You need to know all that terminology. I don't know that it's going to help you to do your work better if you know that it's called a centered heading, but it will help you in terms of realizing that there is a break in that hierarchy because there's a range expressed there. So, it may be helpful for you to know the terminology or more just to understand the principle of it. So, other sources of additional digits. A whole system or some part of it, and this can be used as a list, and it will actually tell you, expand out this way. You're going to use this. Or you can have a table extracted from some part of the schedule. And so this is sort of all throughout WebDewey. It'll say add to the base number of 636.50 the numbers, and numbers being digits, so the digits out, following, and then it'll tell you the order. You will see this when you look at your standard subdivisions. It'll say you're starting with this range. So 001 to 009, you're starting with the range, and then you're going to expand out following a particular list and pattern. The most commonly used set of categories or digits are found in the table 1, which is the standard subdivisions. Now we have other subdivisions. There's a whole list of tables and subdivisions, so do not think that you are limited to table 1. And in fact, as we go forward, especially class 4, when your exercise is focused on number building, we will actually use multiple tables. So we won't be using just the animal husbandry section, we'll be using some others. So that's sort of our big final exercise where you will be doing number building. So, table 1 consists of things like publication, qualifiers, and this would be like form and audience, and then topic aspects, and that's where you can get a little bit more information. The really important thing to know about table 1, and in WebDewey, the tables are down there at the bottom in a list. So you'll see like T1 and tables. Tables will take you to the full list where you can see everything. T1 will actually take you directly to table 1. Table 1 is the only table that precedes every one of its categories with 1 or more zeros. And that's because it is the first table. So again, think about your workflow. Think about how you start, and then make sure that you consider all of those facets. I've given you some good tips for looking at subject headings to give you a sort of a little trigger or tip that you might need to consider those things, but by all means, do not limit yourself to just what's in the subject headings for developing your facets. Though I will say your facets and your subject headings should be very closely tied together. But there may be times, especially if you're dealing with an older record, if you're dealing with a record that's less complete, if you are copy cataloging or you are retrospectively adding that, after the fact, the item's already been cataloged for a while and it's an older thing, but you want to give it a better Dewey number, then what you give it may not exactly match your subject headings. You may expand out more, you may follow whatever guidelines that you have for how you're going to subarrange. But do consider those notations and do look to your subject headings to give you sort of those little triggers and guidance in terms of how those will fit. I can't stress these parts of it enough, and I know I've said it so many times, you're getting tired of hearing me. Follow the hierarchy, follow the hierarchy, follow the hierarchy. I know, you get tired of hearing it. But in order to be able to use Dewey and to really feel comfortable with it, you do need to understand the structure of the system, which is why we focused on it so much. You need to be able to understand the relationship between the categories and the notation, and then how to read and interpret that information. Hospitality and expressiveness, it's on the list, but I'm going to say that's less important. I mean, you just need to know that Dewey expands and there's room for expansion and that kind of thing. Because unless you are proposing new numbers or you're developing a completely new number, if you're just sort of, slotting in your item in that existing list and then following the guidelines, you're probably going to bump up to this a little bit less than somebody who's doing a lot of original cataloging, especially new materials. You may sort of be wading into new territory there. And if you are the person wading into new territory, good for you. Somebody needs to do it. But you will be the one who will be very glad that there is room for expansion. And then when there's not, looking at how things can fit in there. The role of the decimal and the zero, and we've already had a lot of good conversation about that. Thinking about those facets that we've talked a lot about today. And then, how centered headings work. Really, that's the important part of it, how they work. Table 1 is your standard subdivisions, and then the table of preference, so that kind of gives you a lot more information. How the relative index works, and we'll talk much more about that next week, as well as tables 2 through 6. So next week we'll talk about the relative index, tables 2 through 6, and then finally the number building techniques. Now the number building techniques, this is really something that you gain competence in and confidence in as you do the work. So the exercises you are going to be doing from now on are all going to involve number building in some way. Exercise 2, or quiz 2 as it's called, was really about hierarchy and sort of delving into the hierarchy and being able to navigate and make sense of what you were seeing. And from there, we're just going to continue to expand in that direction. Your final assignment, so for class 4, will be entirely number building. So, you really, now's the time to sort of get comfortable in the hierarchy, spend some time navigating in it. The exercises that I give you are meant to be open book, so please do consult your resources. I'm not expecting you to memorize a particular notation and be able to recite that back to me. That's not the point of it at all. The point of it is for you to actually go through the schedule, find the information, confirm that you have the right answer. So if you're a person who is really good with numbers and you just have memorized a whole bucket of Dewey numbers and notations, and you I know exactly off the top of my head what William Shakespeare is. then, and I do, I did so many of them, then you are going to know that information, but I want you to go through the schedules and confirm it because I want you to see that process for yourself. If you have been cataloging for a long time and you're very, very comfortable with doing, you kind of have a lot of it in your head already, please, I'm very proud of your knowledge, and that's awesome that you have it in your head, and I know how that feels to have that information in your head, but please do go through this act of following the hierarchy and following the schedules, because this is a good opportunity for you to refresh your workflows and to sort of re-ingrain how you trace that hierarchy and understand how those things fit together. You may explore something and find something completely new in the process of doing this. So, practical tips for success. Always follow the instructions. Can I say hierarchy one more time? Follow the instructions, follow the instructions. In every table, even the most minute and lowly subclass. There is no such thing as lowly and minute in Dewey. Really, there's not. So follow the instructions. If you're in Web Dewey and you just search and you come upon a number and you think, yay, there it is, right there, I've got it. Trace your hierarchy back up to the top and make sure that there is no notation or note that you need to be aware of that impacts your choice, because there may be notes at a higher level, and that's what they call the forced hierarchy, where it actually applies to everything down below that particular note. So you're going to want to carefully make sure you read those notes. Always, always read the notes. I know sometimes they can be a little bit confusing. You can read the notes and then you can do some searching in OCLC and see what you find and see how those things fit together. That's another kind of way to kind of see that practical versus what you're looking at kind of thing. If you see an asterisk in the instructions, do not ignore it, ever. Never, never, never. Never ignore the asterisk, because that is a very important thing telling you something, so pay attention. Remember the range of numbers. We've already talked so much about the range of numbers. It does vary for classes, and centered headings vary just across Dewey. So I can't tell you exactly where you'll see a centered heading. I know 372 to 374 is a centered heading. There are others. So, take a look at that one. That's a good one to take a look at, but just know you may find them elsewhere. There are some patterns in Dewey, and we looked at animal husbandry, I believe, already a little bit, but those are not always consistent patterns. And this is true in the Library of Congress classification too. Oh, is it ever? So, I think Dewey's in a lot better shape in that way, because there are some real differences in how things are set up within those two. Do not use the relative index to classify. This is just a reference resource, and we're going to talk a lot more about this. Use the schedules and don't use the abridged. Now, if you were just sitting at your desk and you just need to zip, zip, zip a call number, or maybe you are a library that just uses the main class or the first part of the Dewey, so maybe you get down kind of granular, like education and or elementary education, and that's kind of as far as you're going to go, and then you're going to subarrange by the author or subarrange by the title or what year or whatever you do, subarrange. If you're that kind of library, if you're doing that, then you can probably use the abridged fairly easily without a lot of problems, because you're not going really granular in your notation building. So, in that particular case, that might be a good place to start. The abridged can be a great place to kind of get going, like where do I want to start? But then please do go over to the full schedules, because the full schedules is really what's going to include all the information you need. Lastly, a colleague passed this on to me a while ago, and I've kept it dear to my heart because it's so true. You will become frustrated. And I'm going to tell you this: if you take my subject analysis class, if you take any of my classification classes, if you take my LOM class this December, you're going to become frustrated probably at some point. But frustration is normal. So remember, depending on where you are in your path of notation and call number building, you may have a little more frustration or you may have a little less frustration. If you are a large library, you may have frustration in trying to squeeze everything into these Dewey numbers without creating a Dewey number that's like 26 characters long, or digits. They're digits, 26 digits long. If you're a small library, you may have things like cherry blossoms and cannibalism sitting right next to each other, and that just may not work for you. Doesn't work for most of us, but that's kind of how it might end up in your library. So, those are the kinds of things that we deal with. It doesn't matter how big or small you are, you have your own frustrations within any classification system. This is true of the Library of Congress classification system. It's true in Dewey. It's just true regardless, because since we didn't build these classification systems ourselves, and they started a long time ago, centuries ago, that's a lot of history. And so there's a lot of history baked into it, and there's a lot of practices and thoughts about the way the world is baked into it. And so we may get frustrated with that, like, that doesn't belong in that category. Why is it over there? It should be over there. So, those kinds of things get kind of, they can be frustrating to us too. And I talked about this already, so I won't get on my soapbox too much about it, but do remember that every number has meaning in Dewey. And so just don't randomly lop them off and goes, well, we only use 6 digits in our library. We lop them off at 6, or we lop them off at 5, because you want to make sure that you're lopping it off or truncating it or not going out far enough. You want to make sure that it's at that logical place. And so if we were to put those markers for every 3 digits, and remember, the zeros are not going to be all the way down. So, if you have something that would end in a 0, it's not going to be a 0 there. So, if we were to have those placeholders and those dashes or periods, it could be, then that, we want to lop it or truncate it at a place that's logical. So we're grouping things together in a way that's logical, because each number has a meaning and it contributes to what that call number actually means. And then I talked about call number conflicts already, so I'm not going to talk about call number conflicts again, but please don't make them. They're confusing to patrons and other people when you have 2 call numbers that are exactly the same for 2 different titles, and it can be confusing for you, and it's just not good practice, so don't do it. And I used this one before, but we're not going to look at this one again, but that's sort of the idea of like how you could break the call number. This is an example of LC, but it's the same sort of thing where you can use dates and things like that to break call numbers. Do consider your end user in terms of what will work best. I know some of you are already talking a lot about your end user. That is those Ferber user tasks. Yay, right? Thinking about, there you're getting your Ferber in there without even knowing it. We're thinking about what works best for our users. There you go. Use those Dewey-based numbers in OCLC or elsewhere. I don't care where you find them. They're fine to look at and use as a starting point, but don't assume they're correct. I know we'd all love to think our fellow catalogers are the most amazing people ever and they never make a mistake, but they do. So, you have those days when you need coffee. Just think about if you multiply that by 10,000 catalogers across the world contributing to OCLC, and they all need a cup of coffee on the same day. It could happen. Use those classification and cuttering tools as needed. So for classification, we're really going to focus on Dewey, and that's all we're going to focus on. We're not going to be doing cuttering using Sanborn or the Library of Congress cuttering tables or anything like that. You may use both of those if that's what you do in your library. And if you are interested in a cuttering class, if you want to just learn cuttering, about that kind of cuttering, please, pitch that as an idea. Let Library Juice know that you would like to have that, because I do not think we have a class where we do nothing but focus on cuttering. On that note, I'm going to leave you with this again. So, think through the process, and we're going to talk about actually using the create call number aspect in WebDewey, but Really, I want you to look at the parts of it that have to do with how you look at the notation. So how are you going to look at how you are actually constructing your call number, that pathway through? And on that note, see you next class, and hopefully it won't storm anymore. Thank you. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.